Hi everyone, my name is Serena Midha, and it's my pleasure to present this work that was done with my co-authors Max Wilson and Sarah Sharples. We investigated the lived experiences of mental workload in everyday life. The motivation behind this is that we now know what to aim for in our physical lives. For example, we know that walking 10,000 steps each day is healthy for all of us, but what should we aim for in our cognitive lives? Well, consumer neurotechnology is arriving, and currently available devices help us to, for example, focus or meditate, but we don't know what type of data might be useful to track over the longer term, like we do of our physical activity. Mental workload is the cognitive activity that we're interested in. It's comprised of the demands of a task and the experience of responding to a task. And it's usually considered in terms of isolated work tasks, where the aim is to prevent someone from becoming overloaded or underloaded, because these are the states where mistakes are more likely to happen. And for that reason, mental workload is usually measured in safety-critical situations. But it's a concept that is also relevant to our daily lives. We frequently perform tasks at home that require different mental workload levels. And we also have a tendency to try and optimize parts of our performances and lives. So we think it could be useful as a form of personal informatics that can help us to make positive life changes. So instead of looking at mental workload from the extremes of overload and underload, we wanted to gain a fuller and more holistic picture from a person-centered perspective to try and start to understand the effects that mental workload has on our lives. So research question 1 was, how are experiences of mental workload perceived? Research question 2 was, what impact does mental workload have on our lives and work, and vice versa? And from that we could start to establish research question 3, what goals should we be setting in terms of mental workload? So we had 19 participants who were all office workers. Each participant tracked their own mental workload in their lives for a week before this interview study, because we wanted to give participants the chance to consider what mental workload meant to them before we probed them about their experiences and their perceptions of mental workload. So the interviews lasted 1 to 2 hours, and we performed an Interpretive Phenomenological Analysis, an IPA analysis on the data, which is a qualitative method. 4 themes emerged, and the first 2 themes kind of set the space for the second 2 themes, which are our main contributions. Theme 1 was general perceptions of mental workload, and each participant had an initial perception of the different mental workload levels, and these could be positive or negative. For high mental workload, some participants perceived that level positively, for example, finding it fulfilling. Other participants perceived it negatively, for example, finding it stressful or overwhelming. And this was the same for low mental workload. Some participants found it relaxing, other participants found it boring. Medium mental workload was perceived positively across the board. Theme 2 was changing perceptions of mental workload, and these 4 factors, outcome, location, pressure and enjoyment, could change the initial perception of mental workload. If we take location and put that into context, an example of this was some participants reported feeling more guilty having a low mental workload at work compared to outside of work. Theme 3 was the mental workload cycle, and this was our main contribution from the research. We identified the need to fluctuate between different mental workload levels, and these fluctuations needed to happen in certain patterns. So from a low mental workload level, participants aimed to go to higher mental workload levels. From a high mental workload level, participants always aimed to achieve a low mental workload level. And from a medium mental workload level, each participant had their own preference about whether they would go up or down. But fluctuating between the levels was important, because sustaining any level for too long would result in negative consequences. So sustaining a high mental workload level for too long was associated with burnout, fatigue, resentment, reduced work quality and poor mental and physical health. Sustaining a low mental workload level for too long was associated with decreased productivity, decreased satisfaction and decreased enjoyment. Sustaining a medium mental workload level for too long, well, it was just less exciting. But including each mental workload level into the cycle is important because each level serves a different and important purpose. So high mental workload is important for work quality and quantity, a sense of achievement, and it's the level where more difficult tasks can be achieved. A medium mental workload level is important for productivity and positive perceptions in life. Low mental workload was important for rest and recovery, preparation for the higher levels, and it was also used as a reward. Theme 4 was the cycle can't always be facilitated. And these three factors, life factors, internal factors, and external factors, could prevent participants from achieving fluctuations in their cycle. So life factors included medical and exercise reasons. An example of this was one participant experienced hormonal changes and reported how they struggled to operate at a low mental workload level during this time. Internal factors included thoughts and effort. For example, participants reported that reaching a high mental workload level required effort, and sometimes they were just less inclined to do so. External factors included circumstances such as operating machinery for a length of time, and task completion, where sometimes tasks just need to be completed at a certain level of mental workload, and this could prevent fluctuations between the different levels. So this study seems to have increased our understanding of the types of cognitive goals that we could be setting in our lives and what data future neurotechnology could usefully track. So more specifically, we identified the mental workload cycle, where we need to fluctuate between the different levels of mental workload in certain patterns. And this seems important to help us optimize parts of our performances and also aspects of our well-being. But these cycles are likely to be individual to each person, in part because of the different perceptions that different people have towards the different mental workload levels. For example, if somebody has more negative perceptions towards a high mental workload level, they might benefit from having less high mental workload in their cycle. But more research is needed to develop these findings. Approaching mental workload from a people perspective could help to increase our understanding of performance at work, especially in terms of overload and underload and the factors that contribute towards these states. It could also help us increase understanding about aspects of our well-being. So thank you for listening, and any questions are welcome.